The Patriot, a brutal war film starring Mel Gibson, paints a picture of a grieving father waging a savage guerrilla war against the British. But what if I told you? This story was inspired by a real man. A man so ruthless in his tactics that the British feared him like a ghost. His name? Francis Marion, the Swamp Fox of the American Revolution. And trust me, the real story is even darker. Stick around, because this is the untold story of America's deadliest guerrilla warrior. The American Revolution was brutal. The British, with their superior numbers, well-trained soldiers, and vast resources, were convinced they could crush the rebellion with sheer force. And for a while, it seemed like they might. Cities burned, patriots were executed, and resistance was slowly being snuffed out. But then, they made a mistake. They thought they could march into South Carolina and crush one man, Francis Marion. They thought they could burn his home, butcher civilians, and send a message. What they didn't realize was that they weren't just fighting a soldier. They had awakened something far worse. Marion didn't fight like the other American commanders. He didn't lead armies into open battle, standing shoulder to shoulder in neat formations, waiting to be shot down. No, he waged war in the shadows. His army wasn't made up of professional soldiers. It was made up of hunters, scouts, and men who knew how to move through the wilderness like ghosts. When the British came for him, he vanished into the swamps, but he didn't stay hidden for long. He struck when they least expected it. His men attacked in the dead of night, emerging from the mist, knives flashing, muskets roaring, and before the enemy could react, they were gone. The British never knew when he would strike next. They feared the trees, the rivers, and even their own camps. Because when the swamp fox was hunting you, you never saw him coming. And this was only the beginning. Marion's war had just begun. Francis Marion had always been a fighter. Even before the American Revolution, he had made a name for himself as a skilled leader, using hit-and-run tactics to harass the British. But nothing could have prepared him for what was coming. Nothing could have braced him for the sheer brutality that would turn him from a soldier into a specter of vengeance. It began with Colonel Banastre Tarleton, a man whose very name struck terror into the hearts of American rebels. Known as Bloody Ban, Tarleton led the British Legion, an elite force that showed no mercy to its enemies. He believed in swift, overwhelming violence, and he was about to make South Carolina his hunting ground. In one infamous event, the Battle of Waxhaws, Tarleton's men butchered American soldiers even after they surrendered. There was no honor, no prisoners, only cold steel and blood-soaked soil. Those who weren't cut down were left writhing on the battlefield, their pleas for mercy ignored. But Tarleton wasn't finished. His next target: the communities that supported men like Marion. British forces swept through the countryside, torching homes, barns, and entire villages. They slaughtered livestock, ensuring that even those who survived the flames would starve. Civilians, men, women, and children, were left with nothing but ash. For Francis Marion, this wasn't just war anymore. It was personal. When Marion returned to find smoldering ruins where his people once lived, something inside him changed. He was no longer fighting for independence. He was fighting for revenge. And unlike the British, he wouldn't march onto the battlefield in neat formations, waiting to be shot down. No, he would make them suffer. With just a handful of men, Marion vanished into the swamps. There, among the tangled roots and murky waters, he transformed his militia into something more than an army. He turned them into shadows. They moved like ghosts, striking in the dead of night, their knives flashing before slipping back into the darkness. British supply lines began to disappear. Isolated outposts woke to find their sentries silenced, throats slit in the night. Tarleton's men, so confident in their power, started to fear the trees, the water, the very land itself, because at any moment the swamp fox could be watching. Enraged, Tarleton set out to hunt Marion down. He chased him through the swamps for over 26 miles, but every time he thought he had cornered his prey, Marion simply melted away, slipping deeper into the wilderness. Tarleton, furious and humiliated, spat out the words that would cement Marion's legend forever. As for this damned old fox, the devil himself could not catch him. From that day on, Francis Marion was no longer just a man. He was the swamp fox. And the British, they were his prey. Francis Marion didn't just fight the British, he hunted them. After the massacre at Waxhaws and the burning of his homeland, there was no turning back. He would use every tool at his disposal, deception, fear, and raw brutality, to make sure the enemy felt the same terror they had inflicted upon his people. His men weren't an army in the traditional sense. They had no uniforms, no formal training, and no interest in fighting by the rules of war. Instead, they became a pack of ghosts, appearing when least expected and striking where it hurt the most. British supply lines, once the lifeline of their war machine, began to vanish overnight. Wagon trains carrying food, ammunition, and medical supplies were ambushed, set aflame, and left as smoking ruins. British couriers and scouts sent to deliver vital information simply never returned. And when Marion's men attacked British troops, they did so with ruthless efficiency. They rarely fought fair battles. Instead, they struck in the dead of night, slaughtering entire patrols before slipping back into the swamps. But Marion wasn't just after numbers. He wanted fear. After every attack, he left one survivor. Just one. That man would return to his regiment, shaking, hollow-eyed, and whispering the same terrifying truth. The swamp fox is coming. The effect was devastating. British soldiers, once proud and disciplined, began to dread marching into the wilderness. Entire regiments refused to leave their fortified positions. They saw the trees, the thick vines, and the endless marshes not as terrain, but as a graveyard waiting to claim them. But the British weren't about to surrender so easily. In a desperate act of retaliation, they burned entire towns to the ground, hoping to smoke Marion out of the swamps. But the swamp fox wasn't a man they could intimidate. If anything, the destruction only hardened him. Every village that burned, every innocent who suffered, only fueled his wrath. His attacks became more frequent, his ambushes deadlier. The British weren't just fighting an enemy, they were fighting a force of nature. And then, there was Banastre Tarleton. The very man who had butchered surrendering Americans now found himself hunted and humiliated. He had once led one of the most feared units in the British Army, but after months of chasing ghosts and losing more men than he could replace, his reputation was in ruins. The swamp fox had broken him. By the time the war ended, the British were in shambles. Their forces were depleted, their morale shattered. Tarleton, once a monster on the battlefield, had been defeated, not in a single glorious battle, but through months of relentless, psychological, and tactical warfare. And at the center of it all was Francis Marion, the man who refused to die, the man who turned the swamps into a battlefield, the man who made the British fear the dark. Francis Marion didn't just fight a war, he changed the way wars would be fought forever. His guerrilla tactics weren't just effective, they were revolutionary. The way he used hit-and-run ambushes, deception, and psychological warfare would become the foundation for modern special forces tactics. Today's elite military units, Navy SEALs, Green Berets, and insurgent fighters around the world, owe much of their strategy to the lessons learned from the swamp fox. He taught that war wasn't about marching in straight lines onto open fields. It was about striking where the enemy was weakest, vanishing before they could retaliate, and ensuring they never felt safe. He proved that a smaller, determined force could cripple a much stronger opponent, not by overpowering them, but by outthinking and outmaneuvering them. His legend grew so large that even centuries later, Hollywood couldn't ignore it. In the year 2000, Francis Marion's story was reimagined on the big screen in The Patriot, starring Mel Gibson. The film painted him as Benjamin Martin, a grieving father who takes up arms against the British after the murder of his son. The themes of revenge, guerrilla warfare, and a lone warrior striking fear into an empire were all pulled straight from Marion's real-life story. But make no mistake, the real story was far darker. The swamp fox didn't just fight battles, he waged a campaign of terror against his enemies. The British didn't just fear him, they were haunted by him. The blood, the brutality, the ruthless ambushes in the dead of night. Hollywood softened the edges, but the truth was far more terrifying than anything shown on screen. And that is the untold story of Francis Marion, the real-life swamp fox. If you want more brutal real-life stories that Hollywood tried to soften, make sure to subscribe. And let me know in the comments, do you think The Patriot did justice to this savage warrior?